I believe that ominous, prolonged drum roll sound is not a portent of our execution, it's the air conditioning. Oliver, good morning, welcome.
Good morning, Vincent.
Again, to put things in context and set the scene ideologically, if I may use that forbidden word, I'd like to comment or ask you about your own description of you on your website, which is rather fascinating, and we'll have one or two things to say about it. But you say to your readers, if you think that economics is about more than graphs and formulae, if you feel instinctively suspicious about political and ideological promises, if you agree that skepticism is a virtue and not a vice, if you don't confuse seriousness with lack of humor, and if you believe that liberalism can help make sense of our chaotic world, then you've come to the right place. Now, those are some claims, but I wonder if you could first of all define for us what you mean by liberalism, because most of the world, and possibly the people in this room, certainly most Kiwis, understand liberal to mean to be in favor of big government, the nanny state, political correctness. President Obama would be the ultimate liberal. I don't think that's what you mean by it. Could you explain to the audience what liberalism is?
It's probably not what I mean, it's correct. Liberalism is one of those words that everybody claims for himself, so that's what I do, basically. Nobody wants to be illiberal, so President Obama would probably also say that he's not an illiberal president. But where I see liberalism is really liberalism in the classical tradition. And the first liberals were those liberals, those economists that invented liberalism in the 1700s. Adam Smith, previously philosophers, John Locke, David Hume, David Ricardo. So the classical liberal tradition that places a lot of value in individual liberty and also tries to point out how individual liberty also leads to the greater social good, to good functioning economies, to productive economies. So that's where the term classical liberalism or liberalism comes from. Unfortunately, many other people have tried to claim this term afterwards, and that's where the confusion comes in. I would say that a lot of the people who nowadays claim that they are somehow liberal are probably deep down socialists or greenies. But I really see liberalism in this very classical tradition that is still very much alive. It was kept alive by people in the meantime like Ludwig von Mises, by Friedrich Hayek. It is still kept alive today by economists working in think tanks today. Not too many economists working in often state-run universities, but we're trying to keep the idea alive. There is still the Von Pellerin Society, an international network of liberal thinkers. And I think we have to reclaim the term liberalism because otherwise everybody else will.
So you want the word liberal back?
Yes.
That's going to be a tough battle, because I think most people understand it to mean the things I described and you just described.
Most people have no idea really what they mean when they say liberal, because they are very confused. They think you can split liberties neatly. So they believe that you can be anti-liberal when it comes to the economy. So you want to prescribe to people what kind of contractual arrangements they can enter into or what are not allowed. On the other hand, they would have no problem, for example, with living your life as you please when it comes to, for example, gay marriage. So you have this very confused debate where some people believe that you can just neatly split liberties. So you can be anti-liberal when it comes to the economy, but you would be completely in favor of free speech and religious freedom and other freedoms, where I think, well, this is a bit schizophrenic. Either you believe in liberty, in which case you should really believe in all liberties, or you don't. But you cannot just say, well, this is the kind of liberty that I think you should have, and others, I think I rather make a decision myself.
So it's not a question of left and right, because obviously by those standards, sometimes we find the left being liberal, sometimes we find it being illiberal, and the same for the right. So all you're asking for is consistency. Be pro-liberty across the board.
Yes, and don't be ashamed of it. I think there's a very proud tradition of liberalism that we can really try to keep alive and revive in parts. And these stupid left versus right debates really don't get us anywhere.
So In other words, someone like the recently deceased Margaret Thatcher would actually fall under the rubric of liberal, according to your classification, most of the time, economically.
Economically, most of the time, but not even economically all the time. I remember that Margaret Thatcher's government in 1990, that was the year when communism really finally collapsed, introduced 5-year plans for house building. That's not quite a liberal philosophy.
No. And in some of the social areas, she was not very liberal either.
No, and she wasn't, for example, committed to the idea of local government, whereas I think most liberals would be, because most liberals believe that you should bring government closest to the people so they actually have a say in how things are run. Margaret Thatcher was a politician who really wanted to have things centralized in London and constantly worked against local government.
But she turned state housing over to the people who lived in it, people's capitalism.
Yes, indeed. So
that was liberal.
There were certainly a lot of liberal aspects about Maggie's policies, but even Margaret Thatcher probably wouldn't classify as a complete classical liberal.
If you compare her, however, with, say, Clement Attlee, who was Prime Minister after World War II, and nationalised everything in sight, that was really big government. And she transformed that, didn't she?
She did, and it was absolutely necessary, of course. If you just go back into the history books and look at how Britain had performed after World War II and how it was positioned in the late 1970s, Britain needed a change. Britain had for about 25, 30 years of its post-war history a very almost unchallenged consensus of a mixed economy, and that was finally brought to a head, this confrontation then by Margaret Thatcher, and she changed things, and she changed them for the better.
And all of this is, of course, directly relevant to the situation New Zealand finds itself in now. Because
we don't have a Margaret Thatcher.
We don't have a Margaret Thatcher. We don't even have a conviction politician of any party, and that I submit, is part of the problem. I don't know if you've been here for long enough to absorb the nature of most of the politicians here, but they are run by focus groups. In other words, it's not a question, what do I believe, and how can I persuade people of the correctness of my beliefs? It's a simple focus group, none of whom has a bloody idea, and see what they say, and get a consensus, and then that's my policy. Every politician here is like Winston Peters.
That's scary. I've only been here for about a year. I must say I felt home immediately because I also come, of course, from a country operating under MMP. So apologies, you took that from the Germans. No, I mean, what you describe is a problem that you find in many countries around the world. You don't have these conviction politicians anymore. I actually want to see politicians, I want to see more ideologues actually.
More ideologues.
I would like to see politicians who you can wake up in the middle of the night and ask any question under the sun and they would have an answer. Whether you agree or not doesn't really matter too much, but at least they would know what they stand for. And I'd rather have a proper informed debate with a committed socialist than a debate with someone who's, well, notionally liberal but doesn't really know what he believes, and rather ask focus groups and opinion polls first. I think the category of politicians, these ideologues, is something unfortunately of the past. So we had, I think John Howard really qualifies for this category in Australia. We had Margaret Thatcher, we had Ronald Reagan. But nowadays, David Cameron, Angela Merkel, John Key, it is a different kettle of fish.
Yes.
It is not the kind of conviction politician that we have in the past.
They are consensus seekers whose minds are made up by the focus groups, and really you can't make
They're political entrepreneurs. They're doing really what they need to do to win elections, but sometimes that's just not enough.
Now you mentioned David Cameron. On your website, you have a page called Love Me, where people say nice things about you. I haven't looked at that. I assume it's your family. But you have another page, Loathe Me.
That's not my family.
You sure? Now, one comment on the Loathe Me page really caught my eye, and it was from David Cameron. Before he was Prime Minister. Well, here he is on your website saying, I gather that's you. He's going to Australia. The sooner he gets on the ship, the better.
And I took that advice.
Now you did? But I looked at that and I thought, now that's nice, mild-mannered David Cameron saying that about nice, mild-mannered Oliver Hartwich. What on earth had you said to provoke his ire?
Well, it's a long story, but
well, just give us the short version.
The short version is actually that David Cameron didn't actually properly read what I said. and commented on that, and that was his mistake. And it took him a few weeks to find out that actually he had commented on something that I had never said, but he never apologized either. So basically what happened was we produced a report, that was my final report in Britain. I had already signed a contract in Australia, so David Cameron knew I was leaving. And I was working as chief economist for his favorite think tank, so we worked quite closely with Cameron and his team. Anyway, the report was about the declining cities of the English North, and if you check figures, they have been in decline for several decades. Liverpool has lost more than half its population since 1930, so people are leaving these places because they don't provide economic opportunities anymore. And what we said in the report was, well, basically twofold. We said, on the one hand, you cannot really force people to stay. So you can try to give them better opportunities in Liverpool, you can try to make them better places, but you will probably have to accept that some people are leaving. And then secondly, we also said, if you're really trying to regenerate these cities, there are better ways of doing it than centrally administered funds provided to them from Whitehall, from London. So actually trust the locals' ingenuity and ask them, what do you think your city should be? So that was the, I think, nuanced message of our report. And unfortunately, what happened was we launched it in the silly season, so mid-August, when nothing else is happening in Britain. And David Cameron was touring marginal constituencies in North England. And the British tabloid press, and they are of course quality papers as you know, summarized our report and said, London-based right-wing Tory think tank led by a German on the way to Australia says, shut down Liverpool. And David Cameron, who probably hadn't even seen the report or the executive summary or even the press release for that matter, he was in one of these constituencies up north and was asked by a Daily Mail reporter, what do you make of that? And David Cameron said, well, this is bonkers. Who says that? Your think tank. Who at my think tank? Hartwich. Ah, Cameron said, I gather he's off to Australia. The sooner he gets on the ship, the better. And basically his whole shadow cabinet joined in. The Labour Party then said, this shows you what arrogant Tories still work in London. The Liberal Democrats, I once worked for them in the House of Lords, said nothing to do with us either. And my co-author was a Lib Dem activist, so it was particularly damaging to them. The Tories didn't want to have anything to do with us. The Northerners, of course, felt insulted. There were Facebook groups set up, so beat him up when he comes up north. I haven't. The South of England didn't like it either because they didn't want to have these Northerners. So basically we managed to offend the whole country. It was a very interesting time. They were digging on my website. They were finding all sorts of nasty stuff I had said. I had an interesting 2 weeks and then left for Australia.
Well, that certainly was punishment enough, I believe.
Maybe I'm here eventually. So. Don't you think
all right, you weren't saying shut it down, but you were in effect saying if it's going to die, let it die. And I think that's what people realised, and that's why they got upset. But it raises questions about, for example, bringing it back to New Zealand. When you have a city devastated by an earthquake, and this city is built on silt on top of a fault line, do you spend billions of taxpayers' money rebuilding it?
Well, the diplomatic answer here, I think, is that most of New Zealand is built on some kind of fault line.
So, but we don't want the diplomatic answer.
But no, seriously, to go back to the report in Britain, we didn't actually say shut down Liverpool. I mean, that was something that the Daily Mail made of it. No, what we're saying is actually that government, when government spends money, at least you want results for your money. And we had a look, it was a long report, it was a third report in a series of reports. And British governments over 30 years spent about £100 billion trying to regenerate these cities. And what we first did was we were just trying to find whether that money had any effect. And when government has a very physical approach to evaluation. So when government does something, they usually build a cultural center, and then they send the government bureaucrat and he checks whether the last brick is laid, ticks a box and says success. And we said, well, that's not why you're doing it. You are actually doing all these programs because you want cities to catch up. So we had to look at a number of other statistics. We looked at, for example, GDP growth rates, GDP per capita. We looked at VAT, value-added tax registrations. We just wanted to get an idea whether these places are actually moving, education results, life expectancy. And what we found in our study was really frightening because we found that all these places that received the money got better. Well, hooray. But then we found that the national average and the top performing cities got even better faster. And so, in relative terms, these cities were falling behind. We said it can't be good policy spending £100 billion over 30 years for no real effect. And so what we said was, in order to shut down Liverpool, that was something that the media actually put into our report. We never really said that. We said you have to face a few unpleasant facts. The first fact is that a lot of these British cities were built at a time of the Industrial Revolution. They were in the right place because they were seaports, they were close to coal and steel, they were just where they should have been in the 19th century. Nowadays, of course, they need a different raison d'etre. So nowadays, you don't have to be close to seaports necessarily. You have to be close to an international airport hub like Heathrow, even if it's as crappy as Heathrow. But you want to be close to perhaps the continent, because Britain has more dealings with the continent these days than it used to. So we said these cities actually need to find a different purpose. And you cannot get the purpose back by just pretending that the geography hasn't changed and that we're still in the 19th century. So we said, let these cities experiment, let them try to become something different. And of course, that was the crux of our report. They resisted change. They were really trying to keep everything as it was and rather subsidize the unpleasant status quo without really creatively thinking what we could do for them.
And that was very much a function of the Britain that Clement Attlee and his government had created 20 or so years, 30 years earlier. But since that time, David Cameron has become Prime Minister, inherited a mess, typical of that part of the world, and indeed the whole world at the moment. Just quickly, before we get on to Europe itself and then back to New Zealand, how do you think David Cameron is doing?
I was personally frustrated working for David Cameron in opposition. And some of the things that Cameron and his party did in opposition were really good, because they were recognizing that the Tory party had become too narrowly focused on just a few issues. They were constantly talking about Europe, they were constantly talking about tax rates. And I mean, that's a discussion that Britain needs to have, but they needed wider policies, and so the Tory party under David Cameron actually started thinking hard about education reform, free schools. Michael Gove, the new education secretary, is pushing that. They were talking about housing policy. That was the area that I was closely involved in. They were actually trying to talk more about localism, so they were developing policies for areas the Tories had particularly neglected before. And that was all fine. The problem I had with that was that in doing so, and talking about all these nice things where we also needed policies, we completely forgot the core. And the core was actually that the Tory party was always a party, at least since Margaret Thatcher's time, of economic responsibility, of fiscal responsibility. And on that front, the Tory party had completely given up and bought this new Labour mantra. And they basically accepted Labour spending plans when it was quite clear that they were unsustainable. You couldn't just keep on spending the way that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did. And that was my frustration with Cameron, and unfortunately when he became Prime Minister, he didn't really have any answers to Britain's fiscal crisis, and I think that's what he's still struggling with.
But he's in coalition with the party from the left.
And it wouldn't have been any different if his party had won an outright majority.
You don't think it would have been?
Well, I remember the discussions I had with George Osborne's team, and George Osborne is of course Chancellor of the Exchequer, and asked him about a year before the last election what the priorities of the future administration would be and where they would like to see some input and research done, and the answer was procurement. And I think when an opposition party tells you that basically all they want to do is continue current policies, but just doing a little bit more efficiently, tweak here and there, you know that you've got a problem.
See, and that battle is raging throughout Europe, is it not? And in the other countries in Europe, you have a situation where people are saying, this is Adolf Hitler's final triumph, because now Germany is calling the shots, and increasingly draconian socialistic solutions are being imposed, such as in Cyprus, where people's money is just being co-opted from their bank accounts without their permission. Which way is it going to go? Is the whole area going to collapse?
Eventually, yes, it will. But to go back to your previous point, I don't quite see the intellectual line between Hitler and Merkel. I think they are two quite different.
No, but Germany is dominant, I think, is what they're saying.
Well, Germany is dominant, but Germany doesn't like being dominant. Let me tell you, as a German, Germany doesn't want to dominate anyone anymore. We tried, that didn't work. We've moved on. Seriously, Germany really wants to be a larger version of Switzerland. That's what Germany really wants to be. You know, Switzerland, rich, affluent, a bit boring, vigorously unengaged in international affairs. That's what Germany wants to be. Because the Germans tried it the other way, and as I said, it didn't work, and after 45, they really just wanted to be respectable, they wanted to be wealthy again, they wanted to have a stable currency, and in a way they achieved all of that. And they were not prepared for actually taking more responsibility on the international stage. They were not even sovereign until unification in 1990. Because they were still under the supervision of the Allied forces of the Second World War. Germany was not prepared to play an international role, and the whole European Union project is really part of that. There is a very interesting test you can run if you want to find whether someone's really German, and you meet him abroad and he's got this strange, funny accent. So you ask him, where are you from? And if he says, I'm European, you know he's German. And the reason is, by being European, you get rid of this stupid identity German, which is not really comfortable. Nobody really wants to be German. The Germans sought refuge in Europe because it stopped them from having to be German. And so they were trying to give it all up. They were trying to become good citizens, good internationalists, good Europeans, and they were not prepared to lead. And that is still a problem in Germany. I mean, I still follow German news on a daily basis, and I can tell you, they are not at all happy with having to run Europe. They're not at all happy with being hated again. Because they said, well, why is it our fault if Greece is bankrupt? Why do they say that it's all Berlin's fault, and why do they actually portray Angela Merkel as the new Hitler? When actually we just wanted to be rich again, and it's not my fault. That is really the German understanding. It's not the final triumph of Hitler. Angela Merkel is not going to send in the pencils to Cyprus. It's not happening.
But rich is really the dirty word, and as you know, there's a dominant strain of thought in Europe, if you can call it thought, represented by the mobs in the streets, who don't want anyone to be rich. They want everybody to be equally poor, and that comes back to the mentality that we've been talking about.
Well, I can tell you about the European mentality. The European mentality, just to give you one example, there is a new poll published by the European Commission of all institutions asking Europeans about their attitudes towards corporate business, and 52% only said that they had a rather positive view of it, and 41% against, and 7% I think also undecided. Then the European Commission ran the same poll in other countries and found that in Brazil and in China and in India, the attitude towards corporates is far more positive than in the European Union. And that tells you something.
And we could stay in Europe forever, but we'd better get down here to New Zealand since
Absolutely.
you're here. And we've got a few things going on here as well. But apparently we are, to go back to the terms that you set out at the beginning of the interview, we are the country in the world that has the greatest degree of liberty. We are the freest country on earth, according to a survey done by 2 think tanks. I know you're familiar with it because you've written about it. We are ahead of the Netherlands, Hong Kong, Australia, and Canada. And poor old America, the land of the free, is down at number 7. And this measures not just economic freedoms, but the social freedoms, as we were discussing earlier. We're number 1. Living here, I find that hard to believe. What do you make?
There's a saying, your true value depends entirely on what you're compared with. So ask yourself, who in this crazy world should still beat a country like New Zealand? The crazy European Union, the Eurozone, Obama's America, or Japan after 20 years of struggling with deflation and now trying to quantitatively ease their way out of trouble. Seriously, there are not that many liberal countries anymore. I mean, you could argue, you could even discuss whether there are any liberal countries in this world. Among the blind, the one-eyed is king. New Zealand, by and large, is not doing too badly. And seriously, who would want to be beaten by the Europeans?
Let's just make that point again. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And that's how New Zealand comes to be number 1 in terms of freedom. And we know in so many respects it is unfree. We've just seen a survey of businesses and how they're affected, for example, by the Resource Management Act, the appalling extent to which it stops business happening. And it's taken years and years to get the government to accept that something needed to be done, and something is about to be done, but we don't know if it will be anything near adequate. But I want to look at the economy overall, go back to some of the figures that John mentioned in his introduction. I would say with growth at 3%, again, depending what you're comparing, that's not bad in today's world. We have a reasonable tax regime compared to most of the others. The government's books look set to be in surplus next year.
Well, it's a meaningless surplus, if you ask me, because long-term we've got massive challenges.
Welfare rolls are falling, so it's going to be possible to pare back at least the rate of increase of government expenditure. But I just want to quote you, for a country offering such favourable circumstances to human development, New Zealand does not make the most of them. And one of your other writers, Luke Malpass, has written, mediocrity has abounded. So what could we be doing better?
Yeah, Luke is always very staunch in his views, but I think he's right in this respect. We could do a lot better. And in the year to January, for example, New Zealand ran a migration surplus of 12 people, net migration. And I can proudly say that the New Zealand Initiative accounts for about a third of that.
Family again.
Yes. So we are responsible for actually making this country grow again. But seriously, we should do a lot better, because the figures that you mentioned are correct. I mean, New Zealand's still growing at 3%, fiscal balance for the time being, not too bad. We are the freest country in the world, and probably one of the most scenic, and quality of life is fantastic, and I don't want to leave again. But if that's all so, how come we're not attracting more migrants? How come we're not doing even better? Because for a country that is so well positioned really between Asia and Latin America, that has a very decent set of institutional arrangements, we should be doing a lot better. And we should be asking the question, what can we do to become a better country still? Whereas I think the debate here is not so much about becoming a better country, but about preserving the nice, decent, relaxed lifestyle that we have. And I think that's a wrong debate to have.
So if you were preparing the budget for next month, what would be in it?
That's not my concern, actually, because I think the government is broadly on the right track to return the budget to surplus. And I have no problem with Bill English mid-term plans. I think they are broadly responsible. Where I have a real problem with this government is that they're completely neglecting the long-term issues. Because the long-term issues for New Zealand are far more important than whether we are getting the budget back to surplus by 2014-15. What I mean by that is last year we had a report prepared by the OECD looking at long-term fiscal issues, fiscal pressures on New Zealand, and as it turns out, there is only one other country, one other OECD country in the world that would have to run a budget consolidation larger than ours to bring government debt to 50% of GDP by 2050, and that's Japan. And the reason for that is, of course, that we have a very generous super scale. And we would actually have to adjust government spending by 10% of GDP per annum from now until 2050 to really reduce debt to 50% in 2050. So while I have no problem with Bill English and John Key's short-term and mid-term fiscal strategy, and I applaud them for that, and I think it's all fine that they're trying to return the budget to surplus as soon as possible, I really criticize them for not thinking long-term. John Key has made it very clear that he doesn't want to increase the super age. He doesn't really tackle any other reforms that could help in this regard, means testing or reducing the level of benefits. But that's really what's required, because otherwise his successors in 40 years' time will not stand a chance of even thinking of a balanced budget. So I think he may be doing the right thing in the short term, but is really failing in the long term. And if John Key really wants to define his historic legacy, it should be a legacy as the man who actually demography-proofed New Zealand's public finances, and he's not doing that.
So there'd be greater emphasis on paring back government expenditure, enabling lower taxation, presumably fewer regulations, getting back to the RMA type situation again. I wonder, among those figures that John mentioned, the figures about private debt and the current account deficit, do they matter?
Yeah, of course such figures matter, but what I found interesting about John's figures was really the composition of private debt, and we could see that the vast majority of it, the bulk, was really on housing debt. Mm-hmm. Well, the question is really, why do we have so much housing debt? Well, because houses are completely unaffordable in this country. We all know the figures coming out of demography every year. They're comparing median house prices to median household incomes, and we are severely unaffordable on this measure. The median household in New Zealand has to pay 6 times median household income for an average house.
5.3 times, which is up from 5.2 the last time they did that survey. In Auckland, much higher, yes. 6 point something. And interestingly, we have no areas in the country where the market is classified as affordable, and not even an area that is moderately unaffordable. So what's the reason?
When you've got prices that are too high, it usually comes down to supply and demand. It's as simple as that. And we know we've got high demand, and we know we've got limited supply. So it's as simple as that. Now, the question is then, what are we going to do about supply? Because I think you can't do much about demand. People still want to live somewhere. So we should actually fix the housing prices on the supply side. And that means building more. Well, okay, building more. How do we achieve that? I think we need to make sure that councils do not block development anymore. We actually have to turn councils, I know it sounds really, really bizarre, but we have to turn councillors and planners into entrepreneurs. We have to, yeah, I get that reaction all the time, I don't know why. But seriously, I did a lot of research when I worked in London for Policy Exchange and David Cameron, and we compared internationally countries that actually managed to achieve house price stability over long periods of time. We're talking 30, 40 years. And we compared that to the British-style experience of declining and deteriorating housing affordability, and New Zealand is firmly in that camp, of course. And the difference between the two groups of countries was really that in some countries, councils actually had an incentive to go for development. For example, in Switzerland, there were local income taxes. In Germany, a council would actually automatically get an upgrade in their state government funding if they managed to attract more people. It was mainly in the English-speaking world that it was the complete opposite. When it comes to development, councils still had to pay for infrastructure, but they didn't get an automatic upgrade, and instead they had to deal with the NIMBYs, you all know NIMBYs, not in my backyard, and the bananas. You know bananas? Built absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. So, if you want to turn the NIMBYs around, if you want to turn NIMBYs into IMBYs in my backyard, and if you want to abolish bananas, and I have no other acronym, sorry, but you actually have to find a system that delivers for them, that actually tells them that when development happens, it's a good thing for me. For example, in Switzerland, I found a canton that grew massively over long periods of time, kept house prices stable by building more, but because they had local income taxes and cantonal income taxes in Switzerland, this building meant that taxes could be lowered for the existing population. So whenever development happened and you approached the population, you didn't meet any NIMBYs because they wanted the development, because they knew whenever development happened, I got better infrastructure out of it, and in the end, my tax bill went down. Well, imagine what a nice incentive that is. So I'm saying we should fix the housing crisis by building more, but we have to find ways of delivering more housing that actually work, that take councils on board and turn councils, as strange as it sounds, into an entrepreneurial force.
On the other hand, you have people saying, tackle it at the demand level, dissuade people from wanting to invest in housing with a capital gains tax. That point of view is very strong here.
Yeah, and I don't even buy the philosophy of tackling housing on the demand side. You can easily tackle the housing on the demand side if you basically ship half the population to Australia, then we're empty again. No, demand is there. Deal with demand by just building more. That's how usual, normal, functioning markets work. If demand goes up, usually somebody else supplies more. Just because the Chinese and the Indians have not developed a taste for driving cars doesn't mean that the rest of the world has to pay higher prices for cars. We just build more. So if there is more demand for housing, you just have to build more houses. And it's just thanks to our very, dare I say, socialist planning system in housing that we don't do it. And we've inherited from the Brits. They've got their own problems with it. I think it's really time to say goodbye to the system because it's part of the Clem-Attlee legacy of post-war Britain central planning that I think needs to be questioned today. And we actually should take inspiration from the countries that managed to keep house prices stable in very similar demand circumstances. I really don't like blaming demand for a crisis that we clearly have on the supply side.
So you'd have no problem seeing the demand go up a lot more, having a lot more people here, a lot more migrants, and you've contributed, did you say it's 12?
No, we contributed, I think 3 or 4 out of 12, 12 net migration here.
Yeah. Of course, a lot of people say one of the beauties of New Zealand is the fact there are so few people, and long may it stay that way.
Yeah, but if you turn it around, the flip side of it is, of course, it's so beautiful, we're locking everybody out. It doesn't make sense to me. New Zealand currently has land mass that is only 0.8% utilized for development. So for us living here, and if you compare internationally, I mean, even in Britain it is 9%. the country wouldn't disappear tomorrow, even if we doubled the area for human development and residential development in New Zealand to 1.8% of the land mass. It would still be a beautiful country, but it would probably be a country with a bigger market, with a bigger domestic market, with a more prosperous, affluent, wealthy population, and I think it's well worth it. Apart from that, I mean, you could have made the argument at every stage in your history, because New Zealand 10 years ago was always smaller than New Zealand now, throughout your history. So that argument doesn't convince me. It's the same argument that I encountered in Australia all the time. I found this particularly bizarre, because there's a big anti-population growth movement in Australia nowadays, and really, if you take all their arguments at face value, they should have just turned around first fleet.
The Australians like to say that New Zealand has 4 million people and 64 million sheep, and the problem is telling them apart. We like to say the difference between Australia and yogurt is that yogurt involves a culture.
I heard that before, actually. Yeah. When I left Britain, one of my colleagues actually asked me to pack some yogurt for Australia.
There's no local culture. But the Aussies have a point with that sheep joke, I think, and I just want to finally, because John did promise we'd talk about education, and that, I submit, is the elephant in the room. And I just want to quote a few pieces from an article on stuff.co.nz from just a couple of weeks ago, where people at the receiving end of what's coming out of our schools are talking about what they see. Employers are expressing frustration at the number of workers who are turning up for labouring jobs despite the high unemployment rate, as they deal with people who turn up drunk if they come to work at all. The Waikato Times reported early this week that employers were being inundated with applicants for jobs, with some 500 people applying for just 50 jobs available at a burger chain that is to open soon in Hamilton. Despite the many jobless, employers say continual absenteeism, substance abuse, and poor work ethic appear to be making a lot of them unemployable. Dave Connell, Vice President of the New Zealand Contractors Federation, Managing Director of Connell Construction, who's juggling operations in the Waikato and for the Christchurch rebuild, said 100 people responded to a Trade Me job advertisement for a junior construction role, but no one was suitable to hire. We are letting 7 people go for every one we keep, he said. I have had some people last half a day and walk off the job with $800 worth of work gear on them. One guy had 6 sick days in 2 weeks, and we have had issues with physicality too. That means when they're told to bugger off, they get violent. Whitehall fruit packers Kristen Goodwin said she had had trouble finding good workers. An administration role she advertised received 200 applicants, of whom 5 were suitable to interview. She completed interviews for fruit packing staff this week and said about a quarter of applicants did not have basic interview skills. I had one guy ring me up and say, a mate told me about this job. I've been told it's piss easy. After I described it to him, he said, oh yeah, I'll be able to piss all over that. Employers and Employers and Manufacturers Association Northern Chief Executive Kim Campbell said he was constantly hearing complaints from employers about job seekers who don't show up on time, can't fill in forms, or once landing the job, disappear for days. That includes people who allegedly have skills. They don't have civic skills. They don't know how to be citizens. And just 30 more seconds, the common job seeker faults that are listed at the end of the article: drunkenness, absenteeism, failing drug tests, physicality when told to leave the site, not turning up for interview, smoking throughout interview, chewing gum throughout interview, no CV prepared, CVs full of basic spelling mistakes. Now, our schools are churning out dysfunctional airheads who cannot spell, construct sentences, or think logically. can't even speak audibly. That's the elephant in the room. And that's the government education system.
A few things about that. First, similar complaints I've heard before in other countries. It's not just a New Zealand phenomenon. I found it quite hard to believe, but it happened in Germany when asparagus was harvested once a year. Despite having at the time a relatively high unemployment rate, the asparagus pickers came from Poland. In Australia, they use specific islanders for the fruit harvest in Queensland, and it's the same problem here. I think the problem with all of this is that we have an education system in many countries that really works rather well on average, but really certainly not for those people who need it most. And if you look at international comparisons, in the PISA study, for example, that the OECD compiles every few years, New Zealand education doesn't look too bad. In international rankings, we're usually number 3 or 4. That's all fine. The problem is when you dig into these figures, you find that there is a long-term underachievement in our system. And these are the people that we have to help. I think, for example, the government's Partnership Schools initiative is a way of tackling this because they are meant to be in Decile 1 schools, so really helping the poorest communities to lift their education achievements. That's something we have to do. What I'm also quite concerned about is it's not just a problem that really just applies to the bottom of the list. When we advertise for jobs at the initiative, we get university graduates with decent qualifications on paper. By the way, not just a New Zealand phenomenon. I had similar experiences actually in Australia and in the UK. So you have people who look really, really impressive on paper. We have PhDs apply for jobs, but they can't spell, their grammar is terrible.
The PhD will guarantee that.
I have a PhD. No, but seriously, I worked together with Oxbridge graduates in the UK. I had to correct their spelling, and I thought, well, hang on, this is your language, not mine. So I'm puzzled why we are producing these graduates, and I'm also puzzled. I mean, if you ever want to apply for a job with my organization, I can tell you what I'm going to ask you in the job interview because it's very predictable with me. I'm always asking people why they studied, what they studied, and whether there were any leading figures in their discipline that actually influenced, shaped their thinking. So whether you're a lawyer or an economist or a sociologist, I would ask you about the leading economists, lawyers, or sociologists, someone who really shaped your thinking. And what I'm really concerned with is that every time I ask that question, I hardly get an answer. So you ask economists, sometimes at PhD level, so name the economists that influenced you most, and I don't get an answer. Or I ask about the challenges that they see to the New Zealand economy, and if they were Prime Minister from tomorrow, the 3 areas they would tackle. And these economists, sometimes, the best answer I heard was actually, no, I've been moving house, I haven't really followed the news for the last 3 months. And that was a PhD in economics. So we have a problem with these underachievers who turn up drunk and can't spell and are not even of any use in any kind of low-skill setting. But I'm also concerned that we've got a lot of graduates who really lack the basic skills that I need in my job. Can't spell, can't write, can't communicate, don't really have an interest in what they do, and I wonder why the hell did you spend 6 years at university trying to get a PhD or longer?
That's what everyone does, they're a dime a dozen. But I wouldn't want everything to sound like doom and gloom as we're about to wrap up. Now, if you spend that time... having spent time in Britain and been invited to leave, and having left and gone to Australia and spent some time there, and now being here, you think you'll be here for a while? Are things good enough to keep you here?
The difference is actually that for the first time, actually, I've bought a house here. We just had our first child.
And affordable, I trust.
Well, moderately so.
We don't have that category.
No, it's okay. No, I like it here. I never really thought I would leave Australia because I actually like Australia as well. I mean, I'm probably one of the few people who actually like both countries. But I can very well imagine staying here. I think the quality of life is fantastic, but I think, as I said before, we could make a lot more out of this country, and that's what the New Zealand Initiative is all about. We're trying to develop the policies that will make New Zealand a much better place, because I think it deserves to be a much better place. It's got not just great scenery, but it's got very creative businesses. very clever people. We should just make sure that these people stay here and don't think that if you're young and ambitious, all you can do is leave. We actually have to develop this country, and I think this country has a fantastic opportunity because the rest of the world is in crisis. But we are really situated geographically between the two fastest growing regions in this world, and that's Asia and Latin America. Other countries would kill for that prospect. Apart from that, we've got a very healthy fiscal situation. We've got a relatively young population of 37 million age. Last time I checked in Europe, it was kind of 44. So the institutional settings are there, the demographic settings are there, the fiscal balance doesn't look bad, the natural circumstances are fantastic. I think there are lots of opportunities for New Zealand, but we just have to grasp them.
Oliver, I very much hope that you stay here and that your words will be heeded. Thank you very much for your splendid insights this morning.
Thank you.